And now would we like to move to the panel part of the afternoon?
Do it.
Yeah.
All right. So the first question is, what does solidarity mean to you? Can you give us an example of a time where solidarity was an intrinsic part of history? What does solidarity look like in contemporary times? So you can answer one or all of those questions. Again, that's what does solidarity mean to you? Can you give us an example of a time where solidarity was an intrinsic part of history? What does solidarity look like in contemporary times? Carrington, can I ask you to answer the first question?
I knew you were going to say my name first. I'm just joking. Yeah, sure. Well, Ellen, for me, solidarity, a big part of that is understanding. And you know, once we understand one another, it involves that coming together in a good way. And when we're looking to have solidarity, it's about holding space for one another, acknowledging one another, validating one another, and just having each other's backs. And when I think of that, I think about my ancestors who came from what is now the United States on the Underground Railroad, and they settled in what is now Nova Scotia. And my papa, when I was younger, and he would talk to us about our family, about how Mi'kmaq and, you know, the Black community came together, and then it was really about survival. And so to me, that's like solidarity in the form of my family and people coming from different, I don't want to say backgrounds, but different experiences, and finding that space within one another. And even though it's not really acknowledged as much, you know, within Canada or our education systems today, it's still a very important piece of history and contemporary solidarity. And so for me, really going back to starting those conversations, ensuring those stories are told, honoring my grandparents and all of the lessons and teachings that I've received from them is how I think I choose to honor my people. And when I think about solidarity today, I think specifically with like Black and immigrant and people of color and Indigenous communities, we need to like sit down and eat together, and we need to get to know one another and like understand each other's teachings and cultural backgrounds, because I don't think that's done enough in a way that's just like authentic and real. And then it doesn't need to be like conferences and these big fancy things, like let's just share a meal together. Let's just like bring out our different types of drums and instruments and songs and just share and get to know where we're each coming from, because once you have that understanding, it can lead to openness and vulnerability that I think is really missing in today. So that's what comes to mind for me.
Thanks, Carrington. Lukayo?
Can't I just like say whatever Carrington said is true and then just smile? No, that's fine. I guess the very first thing that comes to mind when I hear the word solidarity is consent and relationships of consent. And I think for me, the whole process that I've seen around colonization and slavery and imperialism is about conquest over consent. And so when the heated topics happen, like cultural appropriation and why that's not cultural exchange and why that's not cultural solidarity, or there's not solidarity, it's because there isn't an understanding, like Carrington said, and there isn't following protocols of relationship and consent. And so you know, like these are teachings that I've learned from other Indigenous folks on this land, from other teachers and elders. So I'm not a genius that's saying anything new. This is just what comes up for me is like, we cannot declare solidarity with the people we don't have a relationship with, that we don't have consent around. We can say that there's like a spirit, like we want to be in solidarity with them, but if you haven't done the work and you haven't, you know, sat around and built that understanding and heard those stories and earned that trust, like that's not solidarity. That's, you know, that's your dream. That's your alone dream. But a solidarity is a relationship of consent. Some of the most intense stories of solidarity that come to mind have always been around BIPOC community gatherings. One of them is a conference, which is hilarious. Carrington's like, no conferences. I'm like, that's fair. The International League of People's Struggles. There was land defenders from the Philippines who were meeting with land defenders from Turtle Island, and it was just beautiful to like have them all in the same room. And they were like, the same mining company from Toronto. Yes, I'm calling you out, Toronto. But anyway, and so it was just great to have folks being like, yeah, we have a united struggle. But then other memories of solidarity. One of my favorite stories is around the voodoo exhibit in Ottawa, and how the museum tried to do well by it, which is very surprising for most museums that are basically just like, I don't know, vaults where bullies show where they took, like if thieves had an art display for all the things that they stole from other people. So what the museum tried to do is they reached out to the local voodoo community in Montreal and the Haitian community there, and also reached out to, at the time, Chief William Commanda of the Algonquin people. And then as the two communities were being reached out to because they wanted to honor the indigenous roots of voodoo and of Haiti, they were like, oh, let's meet over this museum exhibit. And the meeting of these two communities was so beautiful that they ended up adopting each other into their communities. And then they went on a pilgrimage so that they planted a tree from Haiti on Algonquin land, and they planted an Algonquin tree in Haiti to solidify that treaty process. Anyways, when some of the elders from the Montreal Voodoo community, because I was at a BIPOC talk in Montreal to another conference, it was more like a gathering. There was food and there was drums, so it was fine. I was just, folks were just crying about retelling the beauty of that solidarity movement of supporting each other's struggles in ways that are beyond just like land defending, which is extremely important, but also of like a spiritual continuity, because they both understand their connection to trees and the land, and the preservation of their culture from appropriation. And then, you know, my final and favorite story on solidarity is of the Black queer community in Toronto, and they planned a renaming ceremony for trans people of color. And it was mostly led by the Black community there, Sunset Service, and I think they're called Sacred Village International now, but there's a specific group of leaders that were doing that, and they opened it up for other people of color. And so I applied, and it was just a great move of solidarity, just because they weren't, not everybody who was officiating the ceremony or taking part of it identified as queer and trans. They really opened it up to all cisgendered and heterosexual people of color. And then just my interaction, and they also had an Ojibwe elder, Elder Patty Wabagun. And so just the interaction between my parents, who respected ceremony even as hardcore conservative Catholics, called in by this, you know, West African diasporic priestess and this Ojibwe elder, and they it was called to them, even though they were raised Catholic, they understood all the ceremonial elements. And so when the elders had asked for everyone in the room that wasn't identified as two-spirit or trans or non-binary to make an oath to care for us, it was one of the most beautiful moments of solidarity, because those elders didn't identify as two-spirit, they didn't identify as queer or trans, but they were calling in people like my parents to be there. And the fact that they were also so welcoming, because it was mostly Black folks and Indigenous folks in the room, but they were just so happy to have my people there. It was just a beautiful act of also like queer and trans solidarity, of spiritual solidarity, and we had met before the ceremony. We got to know each other's ceremonial elements. We got to understand each other. We tried to debrief my parents as much as possible about respecting the protocols, and then they also followed up with us afterwards. There was food, there was dancing, there was singing. So for me, those are kind of like three of the most pivotal solidarity moments that in my lifetime that I can remember. Yeah, thanks for asking.
Thank you for sharing those stories, Lukayo. Yeah, they sound really beautiful. I definitely would have cried at those. I want to note that I have not cried at this panel, like the last week. Yet. I'm pretty proud of myself for it right now. I'm keeping it together so far. RJ, would you like to kind of wrap up that question?
Yeah, for sure. I think when I think of the solidarity between migrants and indigenous folks, it has to come with the acknowledgement that I find my communities are particularly super racist when it comes to talking about anyone who is non-indigenous and also non-white, unfortunately. It also had to come with a lot of unlearning and relearning. And also I think a lot of folks don't talk a lot about how unlearning racism is actually really painful. So I think I was someone who spent a lot of time in Ottawa's urban indigenous community, and when I came out as queer and then trans, I found there wasn't much space for me to exist in indigenous spaces. So I started to access queer spaces for the first time in my life, and I wouldn't typically access those spaces mostly because of the ways that I didn't trust any non-indigenous spaces. And I find that's a very typical attitude that a lot of indigenous folks can have, because we have tons of services that are very much central to who we are. We can go to a friendship center and get cultural services. There are indigenous health centers, so we can go to indigenous spaces continuously. Indigenous alternative learning programs. So there isn't much there's not actually much opportunity, and maybe opportunity isn't the right word but to exit kind of out of that bubble of just indigenous folks. And I found I had to when I was queer. So when I think of solidarity, I think a lot of that was realizing that life exists outside of indigenous people. And I think before I was out and spending time in queer spaces, and kind of getting into more of OPERC spaces as well, I didn't care about the thought of leaving Canada, because in my head I'm well, this is my people's land, I don't actually have to leave. And I think that's such an ignorant way to think when I think back on it, because I think in order to actually think outside of racism, you have to think about things in a global context, and realize colonization doesn't just happen in North America or to indigenous people. And I think that was really hard to grasp, because it came with a lot of hurt feelings about being native on this land, and thinking other people could feel the same kind of pain you were. But it was necessary to start to create spaces of solidarity and bringing different communities together. And it was through a lot of reflection of my own actions and how easy it was to normalize anti-Blackness and Islamophobia and racism towards others. It made me understand that this is actually just a norm that was set up from the government, and the government actually doesn't want us to come together. And it's very clear with the ways in which the immigration process totally makes immigrants lie about the true history of Canada. And really all of this kind of just goes back to knowing where there is intentional history that was withheld from you, so we can keep these barriers between people who have similar experiences to each other. And I think the only anomaly that really made me look outside of what was comfortable to me was being queer. So I think like my queerness gave me access to this whole other understanding of like solidarity, because it required me to look inward and really challenge behaviors and understand that like challenging like racism within yourself is going to be an ongoing journey, and it's going to suck, and it's going to be a continuous thing. But also like having the skills and learning how to talk about those things in my own community spaces with other Indigenous folks. So I find that like there isn't actually much funding that we can even see on a government level that actually intentionally brings like migrants and Indigenous folks together. That is just not a thing that tends to happen. And I think that's very intentional to keep our history separated, even though we go through very similar struggles. So I think, again, like when I think of solidarity, I think it's important to acknowledge that like, yeah, even as Indigenous people, we can cause harm to other people. It's important to acknowledge those things if we want to be able to build these really important relationships that kind of go back to things that Lukayo was mentioning around consent. And honestly, like it's hard, but I think it's also worth it, which is why we did the whole commune thing. And that's, and I think like a lot of like looking at what does creating communities outside of our own communities look like. And I think I've inherently had to do that because I'm queer. I've been able to evolve my understanding of community and know that everyone can be a part of that space. It doesn't just have to be Indigenous people, but I know a lot of Indigenous folks who would struggle with that thought. So I think like too, like, I'm just gonna leave it at this, but like I'm Soto and I'm Cree. Cree Nation being from the plains, being a very nomadic nation. My understanding of home, I think, goes back to the way that my people used to live, and knowing that your home can also change depending on where your people are supposed to be. Because I find so many folks are always tied to territory and saying like our home has to be that territory. And I do believe that, but also like both of my nations traveled from the, you know, original territory that they were in. And we're able to create homes everywhere. And I want to use that as an example in terms of being able to create my own homes, even though I'm from the plains and I'm now living on Algonquin territory. And I think it's possible to create different communities here. And it doesn't always have to be tied to like the reserve that I'm from, but being able to practice like all of our teachings and relearning those things, but being able to include non-Indigenous folks in that. And I think that's so important and crucial that like a lot of my friends are migrants, and I wouldn't have it any other way. And I think I learned so much from them, and they give me access to this language that I wouldn't even know certain things about the own things I struggle from if it wasn't for listening to their struggles. So I think it has to be like, there has to be rapport where folks can listen to you, but we also have to listen to them, because I find also like natives tend to only want to listen, only want to actually give to others, but not listen. And I think that's unfair. And we have to create more spaces where we're intentionally giving back to each other. And I think that's what solidarity is being able to create those spaces. But I think queerness is the anomaly that tends to be what brings different folks together and have that ability to come together. Because I find a lot of like cishet folks, like they can do it, but they struggle with it in a different way than when you're queer. It's more of like, you have to do it for survival in a lot of ways.
Thank you, Rajay.
Yeah.
I think it's really, I think what you mentioned, highlighting sort of like the divide and conquer strategy of like oppressors is really important. And that's how we are ignorant and are unknowing of our histories, even though we share similar oppressions.